Okay, welcome back from this coffee break to our last plenary session today. And our speaker is Professor Mirosław Pawlak. He's professor of English at the Faculty of Pedagogy and Fine Arts at the Mickiewicz University, Kalisz, Poland, and the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at University of Applied Sciences in Konin, also in Poland. His research interests include form-focused instruction, corrective feedback, learner autonomy, learning strategies, motivation, willingness to communicate, emotions in L2 learning and teaching, study abroad, English medium instruction, and pronunciation teaching, so really broad array of research areas. Professor Pawlak is editor-in-chief of journals Studies in Second Language Learning and Teaching and Konin Language Studies, and the book series Second Language Learning and Teaching, published by Springer. He has published over 300 books, edited collections, book chapters, and journal articles. So, Professor Pawlak, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. We'll have a little bit of a change of setup here because I just hate sitting behind the desk, so I'll just move around if you don't mind. Yeah, so I'll just stand somewhere here, or if you don't mind, because I just feel it's just better this way. So thank you so much for the kind introduction. Thank you so much for, I would like to thank Pilar for two things actually, for the kind invitation, and hospitality, because I think that we have been feeling it all since we arrived here, but also for the inspiration to actually give this talk. Teaching children is not really my kind of thing too much, but I will do my best in this talk, especially at the end of this talk. I was a secondary school teacher in Poland for 12 years before I basically joined the academia. I did my PhD when I was a secondary school teacher, so basically I have some experience in teaching in Rio schools, which I think is so important for academics to have this kind of experience. And today I'm going to be talking about grammar learning strategies, which is like an area that has been neglected basically, and most of the research which is available has been conducted in Poland, I guess, just with the exception of a couple of papers based on studies conducted in other countries. And today I would like to talk about how we can somehow relate this research to apply this research to children. And in particular, at the end of my talk, I would like to give you an example of what we are doing to adjust the tool that I developed, the grammar learning strategies, so that it is suitable for application with children. So basically, this is the idea here. I was really hoping to be able to present the whole tool today. It is not really possible because some things are still kind of in progress and some data are being collected, but you will see where we are going with this. Okay, so this is the idea. Okay, so let me first of all run you through the outline of the talk. First of all, I'd like to clarify something so there are no misunderstandings in connection with this talk. Then I'll just offer a few comments on grammar learning in particular, and grammar instruction in the case of children. And then I'll move on to learning strategies and grammar learning strategies in particular. I'll talk about the classification that I developed a while ago and the instrument that is based on this classification. And then I'll move on to basically the application of all of this to children, not very little kids, I would like to make it very clear, but children who are kind of capable of grasping what grammar is or how grammar works to some extent. Okay, so I would like to make this caveat very, very clear at the very beginning. I'm not really prepared to talk about 6 years old at this today. No, not today, definitely, maybe sometime in the future. So I'm not going to be repeating the obvious in the sense of talking about the characteristics of children, because I think that, this is what the conference is about, and this has been said many times. I will not be trying to resolve all the debates concerning grammar teaching, because of course there is a lot of controversy still. You have different theoretical positions, you have different pedagogical proposals based on those positions, including different recommendations concerning the provision of corrective feedback. I'm not really going to be discussing this. So the focus here will be on children 11, 12 years old, especially in the last part of the talk when I focus on the tool that we are developing. Emphasis is placed on the EFL context. I would like to make it very clear, because I understand that some people are not very happy with this distinction anymore. But to me, as somebody who has been based basically for many, many years. I was born and actually have been working in Poland and this part of Europe. I still feel that there is a difference, okay? And clearly, sometimes we tend to forget that what happens in big cities like Warsaw or Krakow or Poznań, where I live, does not really translate into what happens in smaller locations in terms of contact with the target language and interactions with users of this language. Obviously, everybody maybe has opportunities, but to what extent they take advantage of these opportunities is a very different story, and whether they believe it's important actually to take advantage of those opportunities is a very different story. What I would like to stress also from the get-go is that I'm not really talking here about learning grammar as the memorization of rules or just getting to know rules, and I would like to emphasize it because when I was presenting a slightly different study on like using grammar learning strategies in call settings, some people said, well, but you know, why should they learn rules? Of course, grammar is about learning rules, but grammar is also about using rules in communication, okay? So I'd like to make it very clear. So when we talk about learning grammar, when we talk about grammar learning strategies, clearly we can talk about getting to know rules, but we should also talk about using those rules in communication and finding ways of using those rules in communication. Right, of course, and that's what Roy said, like this morning. I see corrective feedback as an integral part of form-focused instruction or grammar teaching, so I don't really see it as something separate. I feel it's just one of the options which are included here. Another very important thing I would like to emphasize is that learning and teaching to me are two sides of the same coin. So obviously I will be talking about grammar learning strategies, but we cannot forget that how learners learn very often is a reflection of how they are taught, okay? And we cannot kind of avoid it, because if the teaching is kind of very traditional and if assessment is very traditional, many students will simply learn in this way just to fit in with the just to make sure they meet the requirements of the system. And two final caveats. Of course, some assumptions and suggestions are speculative, and also this work in progress. So I would welcome all suggestions, okay? Because clearly we are somewhere in the middle of conducting the study, and obviously any suggestions would be more than welcome. Now, just a few words about grammar, because I just feel we heard so much about explicit and implicit today, but I just wanted to say that to me, I don't want to discuss all the details here, but basically what teachers need to understand, not only researchers, because sometimes when you look at research, when you have measures of second language knowledge, like measures of grammar, or the attainment of grammar, you don't really have too many measures that actually tap into like more communicative use of grammatical structures. So I'm talking about intervention studies, and I think in many of those studies we don't really have the kind of measures that provide us with information whether learners are capable of using a specific structure in communication. So to me, it's a very important distinction, explicit and implicit knowledge, or I will just mention this in just a second, automatized knowledge. Okay, so clearly the aim of grammar instruction in general or grammar learning is not, explicit knowledge as such, okay? It is a crutch along the way, but the aim should be the ability to use this kind of knowledge in communication. In real-time processing, this is a major challenge for teachers, and this is something that very often simply does not happen in the classroom, okay? So if we think about it in terms of the PPP, the third P is not there, or the third P is not the right kind of P in the sense that you don't have the kinds of activities which would allow students to kind of transform or to kind of automatize what they know to use in communication. Yeah, this was also mentioned today, of course, as a teacher for so many years, and I have to believe in the interface position, because otherwise, what can we do, basically, right? So obviously learning can happen implicitly, there is no doubt about it, but the right conditions have to be in place. There needs to be a lot of exposure, and I don't want to go into this, right? So basically, so this is, I believe very strongly, this is what we have to try to develop as teachers. So we have to provide learners with opportunities to automatize their conscious knowledge of rules or multi-word units or what have you, so that they can be used in communication. And this also applies to grammar learning strategies, to learning grammar, and this is the point I will try to make a little bit later. And also, well, my talk is based on the assumption that when we talk about language learning in foreign language contexts, we have a mixture of explicit and implicit processes. I don't think that you can really neatly separate them, because clearly, you know, it's like in a country like Poland, it's inevitable that there will be some explicit grammar instruction at some point, and clearly I think implicit, explicit, I mean, you know, they kind of, the two types, the different processes like come together. And there was a question, I think, this morning or earlier today, or a comment that implicit instruction leads to implicit knowledge. Of course, it doesn't have to, right? Because it just depends. Can we really make instruction 100% implicit in a context where students have access to course books and whatever? So it's a very complicated thing. Now, just a couple of things about teaching grammar to children really quick. Of course, age has to be taken into account, and well, clearly when we talk about very young kids, implicit instruction would be very important, but clearly when they grow older, I mean, some elements of explicit instruction can be introduced. Well, obviously, you know, one thing to consider, something that is not very often talked about, but the use of the L1. I think that it's something that is a major issue, and I feel sometimes is necessary. On the other hand, terminology, like some teachers in Poland are kind of crazy about introducing all those, but even in course books, you have like, I review course books for, I'm a reviewer for the Ministry of Education, and really sometimes the publishers kind of overdo it with all the terminology, which perhaps is not necessary. And you can see this terminology even in course books for elementary school, right? So not for little kids maybe, but you know, they're really big on terminology, and I don't think that we need to have too much. There are some studies showing that repetition is important. There are some studies showing that it's possible with older children to develop metalinguistic awareness. Clearly, children need opportunities for interaction and corrective feedback. De Keyser said in 2017 that we really need to take into account individual learner profiles. I'll talk about this a little bit later. And finally, we have a body of research, including many studies co-authored by Pilar here, which have shown that basically form-focused instruction does work in the case of children, and basically I mean, it has to be the right kind of instruction, of course, and we probably all agree in this respect. Now, and this is a diagram that I love, and this was initially taken from Ellis 2010. I modified it, I think, in the book that I published in 2014, maybe, as far as I remember correctly. But basically, when we think about learning grammar, or learning, well, foreign language in general, but we are focusing here on learning grammar, this can be instructed, uninstructed. Very often it's a combination of some kind, because we have to assume that, you know, learners have the benefit of instruction, but they might decide to do stuff on their own as well. Now, so we can teach grammar in many different ways. We can try to learn grammar in many different ways. But what we have to remember is that we have like mediating factors, and those mediating factors have to do with the language. So some structures are more difficult than others. However you define difficulty, there is a lot of debate here, obviously. There are contextual issues at the macro level. So I would say that, you know, a situation where you have contact with the target language on a daily basis is very different from the situation where you basically mostly have contact with that language in the classroom. And clearly, but also at the micro level, I mean, when you teach grammar, much depends on whether the students have already been exposed to a particular structure. And I think this, when we talk about corrective feedback, I mean, recast, for example, might be more effective if students have already been exposed to a particular grammatical structure. And clearly we have a number of individual differences, okay? So this is something what I'm going to be talking about today, grammar learning strategies, but of course, individual learner profiles are critical. And I was kind of talking with Karen earlier today. Of course, when we talk about individual differences, I mean, there's those cognitive individual differences like working memory, aptitude, but obviously we have a lot of others, right? Like willingness to communicate and learning strategies and learning styles, even though some people don't like it anymore. I mean, the concept of learning styles. We have like anxiety, emotions, motivations, what have you. So I mean, there are a lot of different individual differences. And my feeling is that even though the impact of cognitive individual differences might kind of gradually disappear, I'm not so sure that the other individual differences level out to the same extent, okay? But this is just probably an empirical question here. All of this translates into engagement, and there is no learning that can take place without engagement, however you define engagement. And then we have learning outcomes. Clearly, we have interaction of different variables, and this is inevitable. And if you look at the literature, obviously there are studies, but of course some studies have been conducted here, but still I feel we have relatively little evidence on the mediating effect of like individual differences, for example, on learning outcomes. I mean, for example, there are hundreds of papers on emotions right now, but I'm not aware of a single paper that would take like different instructional techniques and actually look at the effects of like, or the mediating effect of emotions, positive or negative, on how this instruction works. We are doing something like this with Lara Gurzyński-Weiss from Bloomington, so we are doing this with respect to corrective feedback. We want to kind of look at the mediating effect of emotions on the effects of corrective feedback. Now, moving on to, let's grab some water. Moving on to language learning strategies, of course, it's a huge field. And we have a number of studies, I mean, hundreds or probably thousands of studies that have been conducted since the seminal papers by Rubin, which focused on the characteristics of good language learners. And of course, there have been calls for language learning strategies to be abandoned, like the late Zoltán Dornia would basically argue that they are not necessary. Later, he changed his mind. But I feel, if you look at the literature, that we have a number of studies right now which kind of are proving that it does make sense to focus on learning strategies, because for a number of reasons, okay? But I think that to me, as someone who worked as a teacher for so long, it's one of those individual differences which is really very close to the concerns of the teacher, okay? With all due respect for all those who do research on working memory, I have done some studies of aptitude or personality for that matter. I don't really think that teachers, like in the classroom, can really capitalize that much on this kind of information because, for example, first of all, they don't have the qualifications to measure working memory aptitude, and second of all, even if they have this kind of knowledge, what do they do when they teach like 200 students a week? I mean, it's just, you know, I don't really see, I don't think it's feasible, I mean, unless we have some, I know, recipes or whatever to do it, but I might talk about it a little bit later. So that's why I believe that language learning strategies are important. Of course, some of those studies have also focused on children, not so much, because it's tough, okay? Data collection is tough, okay? It's not so easy, especially when you talk about young children. It's not so easy to collect data. You know, so the studies that were conducted and involved children very often would rely on observation, for example, maybe some kind of stimulated recall, this kind of thing. But generally speaking, most of those studies, you know, have focused on like older learners, older in the sense older than children, so either teenagers or university students or older learners. A couple of new developments in the field, like self-regulation and complex dynamic systems. Very controversial. I am myself not a very big fan of CDST, but I don't want to go into this right now. But anyway, there is a lot of impact of complex dynamic systems on the field of language learning strategies. And to my mind, and since I have been interested in language learning strategies for a while, I have always believed that perhaps the most promising are the studies which focus on very specific areas of the target language. So I think that rather than talking about strategies in general, of course you can do it if you want. I mean, I believe that there is room for any kind of research. It probably makes more sense to focus on language learning strategies with respect to specific areas of the target language. So like reading, like vocabulary. And some of these areas are neglected, and I'll just mention 3 areas here where I have done some research, in particular pronunciation, pragmatics. So Andrew Cohen has been doing research on this, and learning grammar. So basically, surprisingly, there are very few studies that would have looked at grammar learning strategies, okay? And Rebecca Oxford, I think in 2007, in one of the first chapters on this issue, said that partly to blame is the communicative approach, especially in the US and so on, and the belief that, you know, grammar is not so important, but obviously this is actually a fact. So we need research on grammar learning strategies, and I argued back in 2016 that strategies are key to the development of autonomy, also the development of autonomy in learning grammar, okay? Because at the end of the day, I really don't think that you can do everything in the classroom, and especially when it comes to learning grammar, perhaps, or pronunciation for that matter, perhaps students need to know themselves to some extent what they should focus on, and they should they should work on this subsystem in their own time. And I'll give you two definitions right now of grammar learning strategies. One which comes from Oxford 2017, from her new version of her previous publication on language learning strategies, and she defines them as teachable, dynamic thoughts and behaviors that learners consciously select and employ in specific contexts to improve their self-regulated, autonomous L2 grammar development for effective test performance and long-term proficiency. It's a very comprehensive definition. Frankly, I don't think that you can do justice to it in a single study, because it implies that you should always look at the dynamics of grammar learning strategies. I'm not really aware of any study except for one that we are just doing analysis on this like a longitudinal take at the university, but it's not easy. So this is something that we can do, but probably we should try to do in the future. And the definition that I have been using for a while, which comes from Cohen and Pinilla Herrera 2009, where they define GLS as deliberate thoughts and actions students employ for learning and getting better control over the use of grammar structures. Now, what I need to emphasize here, and it's really very important because this definition is so useful to my mind because it stresses the conscious part, so like getting to know rules and learning rules, but it also focuses on the use of those rules. And when I say the use of those rules, I don't just mean like exercises or controlled activities, but also the use of those rules or structures in communication or in spontaneous interaction or semi-spontaneous interaction, because obviously in some contexts, and I think Roy also said it this morning, I mean, students don't really say much, but I mean, as much as we can, if we can stimulate spontaneous interaction. Now, so when we look at research into grammar learning strategies, we have a number of possibilities, and this is just a very simplified version of what we can do, and this applies to any age, to my mind, so this is like something that we can, so this the kind of research we can conduct with adults, with university students, with teenagers, with children. So we can, basically the main distinction is between the macro perspective and the micro perspective. When I say the macro perspective, I mean like huge numbers of participants, instruments that we validate, advanced statistical procedures. I mean, those procedures have been getting more and more complex. Pilar will probably agree that when you get submissions to journals, I mean, some of those statistical procedures are just, so complex right now. And basically, we look at general patterns, okay? We want to establish general patterns, so we can look at GLS use, like different patterns of GLS use. We can look at mediating factors and proficiency. We can look at instruction, okay? So we can basically try to determine to what extent a particular pedagogical intervention has an effect on the use of grammar learning strategies and also attainment. And we can have the micro perspective, which is basically investigating the use of grammar learning strategies in the performance of a specific learning task. We don't have too many studies here, and I'll mention just a few later in the presentation. And also something that I did not include here, clearly we can also have longitudinal studies which look at how the use of strategies changes over time. And I would imagine that they can be undertaken from both the macro and the micro perspective. Now, looking at just a few words about the tools that can be used and the procedures that can be used to investigate grammar learning strategies. I will not be discussing this in detail, but we can, of course, use questionnaires, we can use interviews, observations, including audio-video recordings. I did a study a while ago where I looked at interactions, basically, like language-related episodes, also as some kind of manifestation of the strategies that students use. We can use stimulated recall, we can use immediate reports, diaries, and we have a bunch of those new methods, which partly inspired by CDST, like experience sampling or retrodictive qualitative modeling or the ideodynamic method, and perhaps there is space to include them in such studies, but I'm not really aware of anybody who's done it so far. But it will be fascinating. So, for example, retrodictive qualitative modeling would be, the intention here would be to look back, okay, and to see why learners currently use a specific set of grammar learning strategies based on their past experience. Okay, so, okay, just to cut a very long story short. Right, and to my mind, most valuable insights are likely to be gleaned from studies that employ mixed methods. And to me, I've always been convinced that we need to kind of combine the macro and the micro perspective, not necessarily in a single study, but basically we have to try to investigate grammar learning strategies, adopting those two perspectives just to get a full picture of what is happening. Now, if you look at research, there isn't too much research. I mean, there are some studies that have been published, but not too many of them. And some information about grammar learning strategies can be found in the good language learner studies, of course, because like Rubin or Stern kind of commented on the ways in which their participants were learning grammar. Very often you would have studies in the 1990s which would investigate like the entire repertoire of grammar learning strategies, and unavoidably there would also be some kind of focus on strategies for learning grammar. Now, let me just mention very briefly some of the studies that have focused on GLS specifically. So, not surprisingly, I think, the bulk of this research has looked at patterns of use, okay? So there was just an attempt to see what strategies are used in different contexts by different types of learners. Many of those studies used actually like general classifications of language learning strategies and the SIL, so the Strategy Inventory of Language Learning, which was just a little modified to some extent. And of course, the SIL is not suitable. I mean, it's not appropriate for the investigation of grammar learning strategies because it was not designed with this purpose in mind. But we have some studies conducted in Turkey. We have some studies, a number of studies conducted in Poland. And I think that the overall picture is that students typically choose those more cognitive, traditional strategies based on formal practice. So this would be the picture that emerges here. A very interesting study by my colleague Olava, who looked at differences in GLS use in the second and third language. This was like English majors also learning Russian, and she provided some very interesting evidence that how learners perceive the language they are learning actually determines the use of grammar learning strategies. There are very few studies that would have investigated the link between the use of grammar learning strategies and attainment. I'll just mention 3 here. Generally speaking, I mean, basically the main finding here perhaps is that like I would say that the use of grammar learning strategies has primarily correlated or affected explicit knowledge. Okay, like in the study that I conducted in 2021, I had like measures of explicit, implicit, or automatized knowledge, and also the productive receptive dimension. And when there was a link, it was in the case of explicit knowledge, which might be related to, again, instruction and like evaluation procedures at the university and so on. But I won't be going into this. And of course, there are very few studies, and I'm only aware of one study also conducted in the Polish context, which looked at instruction and GLS use. Currently, we are in the process at my university and 2 other universities of conducting a large-scale study which involves instruction in grammar learning strategies to English majors. So this is very much work in progress. I mean, there are so many, problems that we've had to grapple with. How many people need to be involved in this kind of intervention and all the unexpected things that can happen. But anyway, we are getting there. I mean, this study probably will be written up at some point. There have been cross-cultural comparisons, like my paper with Kata Cizer, which appeared in Applied Linguistics in 2022, or it was probably 2023. And we have very few studies that would have adopted the micro perspective. So we don't really have too much research that would look at the use of grammar learning strategies in the performance of specific tasks, which perhaps is not very surprising, because when you look at the research on language learning strategies in general, you don't really have too many studies of this kind either. And the latest appeared, I think, in Language Teaching Research, and this is a very nice study which looked at self-regulation in consciousness-raising tasks. And we have a number of validation studies happening right now, like Iran, China, and also with the help of Pilar, we collected data for Spain. So we're hoping to validate the tool here. I'll talk about the tool in just a second. Now, so basically, a couple of years back, I came up with a classification of grammar learning strategies because I was convinced that we do need a classification. mainly because the existing studies have relied on existing classifications like those proposed by Rebecca Oxford or O'Malley and Shamo. And those classifications do not really take into account the specificity and uniqueness of learning grammar. So that's why I decided to come up with this classification of grammar learning strategies. And one thing I need to say from the get-go, the classification is meant to be general and not language specific, even though I'm fully aware that the challenges of learning a specific language will be different, okay? So there might be slightly different challenges in learning like Spanish, Polish, English, or French, or whatever, or German. And this might be the next step, but basically my intention at this point was to come up with a classification. The points of reference was, there were like a couple of points of reference, but the classification of language learning strategies by Cohen and Dorney, 2002. The division of options in teaching grammar proposed by Ellis, which I refined in 2006, and also outcomes of previous research on grammar learning strategies. So this is the classification, that I introduced. And basically, we have a division here into 4 types of strategies, so metacognitive, affective, social, and cognitive. And again, I'm fully aware that there are many opinions in the field that we cannot divide strategies like this because they perform different functions. And of course, I agree, but I just think that for the sake of research, sometimes we need to have some simplifications and we need to try to categorize some phenomena to be able to come up with findings that can provide a basis for pedagogical recommendations. So metacognitive strategies basically supervise like the learning process. Affective are about feelings and emotions. Let me tell you right now that I have conducted a number of studies, and typically this category has not really fared very well in statistical analyses, mainly because we have focused on university students, English majors, and so on. But there have been reliability issues with this category to a large extent. Social, so learning with others, and cognitive, which basically constitute the core of the whole classification because they're involved in the process of learning grammar as such. Okay, so these are the strategies that are actually applied when learners are making a conscious effort to learn the rules, to practice the rules in a formal way, but also in spontaneous communication. And those cognitive strategies are subdivided into 4 groups. Like I focus on form, so basically using grammar in communication, the development of explicit knowledge, the development of implicit knowledge, or automatized knowledge. I mean, I'm not really, I don't want to go into this, but clearly I'm aware of the controversy here. And also the strategies that students can use to capitalize on the corrective feedback that they receive on errors involved in when they produce grammar structures. Now, on that basis, I developed the Grammar Learning Strategy Inventory in 2013 and also 2018. It has been used in a number of studies. One of those studies is PAWLAK and Schisser, 2023. It has 75-point Likert scale items, and clearly, the subscales reflect the subgroups included in the classification. So production and reception of grammar in communicative tasks, so basically what we would call focus on form, so focusing on grammar in the course of meaningful communication, developing explicit knowledge through deduction or induction, developing implicit knowledge through controlled or communicative practice, but also through production and reception, because very often we kind of forget that when we learn grammar, I mean, there is a tendency to get students to produce grammar, but grammar can also be learned kind of receptively when students are encouraged to pay attention to form meaning mappings, and also provision of corrective feedback. Now, just some examples really quick. I'm checking the time here, but I'm hoping that I still have time. Yeah, so some examples of the strategies that are included in the classification, and I will not be discussing all of them, but being able to identify strengths and weaknesses, so this would be metacognitive. Affective, like rewarding oneself for doing well on a grammar test. This is really the most problematic category, and I'm not trying to say here that affect doesn't play a role in learning grammar, but I feel that we need to approach it slightly differently. Okay, I don't know how at this point, but this is definitely something that needs to be considered. Social GLS, so basically working with others, like practicing grammar with other students, and then the core of the classification and the core of the tool, so cognitive GLS, like reception and production of grammar in communicative tasks, like noticing structures highlighted in a text, developing explicit knowledge, so like paying attention to rules, developing implicit knowledge, doing controlled grammar exercises, one example, and then provision of corrective feedback, paying attention to teacher corrective moves, for example. This would be a strategy that would fall into this category. Now, let's move on to children, because this is what I came here to talk about primarily. So let me just consider some issues that inevitably come up when we want to investigate grammar learning strategies among children. And please remember that I'm talking here about children 11, 12. I'm not really trying to talk about really young children. I don't really think that, I'm not really ready to talk about this at this point. But of course, the bulk of research has been conducted among university students. This kind of research and those tools we have been using are not really applicable, okay, and something needs to be done to adjust them. What are the issues here? Let me just mention them really quick. Some tools are unlikely to yield valuable data. I'm not really sure, like for example, the diaries would do the trick, and a number of other tools that we could use, okay? Or if you think about retrodictive qualitative modeling and so on, I mean, these tools would probably not produce the kind of data that we would hope for. Some GLS may be difficult to tap into, I would imagine, so some categories of grammar learning strategies, especially those involved maybe in like long-term planning and so on, might be kind of difficult to tease apart. There is an issue of abstractness of grammar, and this is something that I will kind of revisit in a few minutes, because I've been really thinking very hard, because when you investigate grammar learning strategies among like students, university students, you can just say grammar, right? Well, let's say whatever that means, but they're kind of aware more or less of what it is. And in the pilot study we are doing right now, one thing that we are trying to find out is whether it's not a better solution basically to talk about a specific grammar structure, okay? So like tenses or whatever, just to contextualize this a little bit more for elementary school learners. Of course, the wording of items needs to be very carefully considered, so we need to get rid of some unnecessary terminology, and of course meta-language needs to be limited to the minimum. The use of the L1, I would say that, you know, in the pilot study we are right now conducting, we are doing this using Polish, but clearly there is a problem if we decide to use the L1. What about like multilingual classrooms if we wanted to move beyond this stage? So I think this is also something that needs to be considered. I don't think that I have answers to all of those concerns. I'm just kind of talking about them to show you that I'm kind of aware of what we are kind of confronted with here. Well, the number of items and queries should be limited. So I mean, the GLSI has like 70 items. I mean, you wouldn't really administer this to kids, so we are fully aware of it. So in the pilot version, it's a little bit different. Attention should be given to complexity of items or queries. Some grammar tasks may be difficult to use, and this would in particular apply to the micro perspective, okay? Because of course, please do not forget that when we investigate strategies and grammar learning strategies, we don't have to use a questionnaire. We can also use the use of strategies in the performance of a specific task. And clearly, you know, some tasks by definition will be very, very difficult for children. Some grammar structures might be of limits. I mean, the more complex ones or the ones that might be very difficult to understand. I know in the Polish context, I think that if you're, you know, we are talking about elementary school, you wouldn't go for wish, or you wouldn't go for maybe advanced conditionals or whatever. So I think you would need to keep things simple. There are also very important logistical issues, okay, like obtaining parental permission or consent, which is problematic. Issues in gaining access to schools, not so easy. Well, I have a network of contacts, and probably it's easier this way, but in general it's not so easy, because at the end of the day it is the principal of a particular school in Poland who basically decides this. Difficulty in securing participants, so this would be like the corollary of the previous point. And when I say participants, I mean children, but I also mean teachers, because you need teachers sometimes to be able to provide some data or some information about how children learn. And also affective concerns need to be taken into account, and ethical concerns, something that I have not included here, but I think that, you know, ethical concerns are always an issue, but I think here, in this particular age group, they might be of particular concern. And normally in Poland, when you do a study among university students, you don't really need any kind of approval for this. But I believe, just like in Switzerland, you don't need any kind of approval for this kind of research. But I believe that with children, this is a very different situation. Thank you so much. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about the study that is currently in progress. So again, I was hoping to be able to provide you with like a preliminary version of the tool, but I would rather not do it for the simple reason that some of the items will definitely change. But I'm hoping to be able to do it in the near future. So, so first of all, the first step was like condensing the GLSI in cooperation with two SLA researchers. So we just got rid of some of the items that we felt were not applicable. So we removed like highly specific and repetitive items. We added, and this is something that I never mentioned, but you may have noticed that we don't really have compensation strategies in the GLSI. This is the decision I made some years back. I'm kind of thinking about it, and we decided to include some compensation strategies in the version for children. When I say compensation, I mean basically a situation where somebody doesn't know how to use a specific structure or how to say something using a specific structure, and he or she looks for an alternative, okay, whatever that might be. And the remaining items were reworded in collaboration with two SLA specialists and 4 elementary school teachers. We created a pool of 32 items, and these items are right now being piloted with about 40 elementary school children and also 10 teachers. Okay, so we just want to look at this point, we just want to see what we need to adjust in those items so we can come up with like an initial tool that can further be piloted and the results can be subjected to analyses. And there are two major issues which I have kind of signaled here. First of all, you remember that the GLSI has specific categories. We have kind of in this initial version, probably will not have like a very strict division into categories, and we'll see what like factor analysis what we are able to come up with on the basis of factor analysis. So this is something that we'll do, and also item specificity. So again, something that I've already mentioned. Do we want to focus on grammar, which is kind of abstract, or do we want to maybe focus on something more specific that might be more tangible to the respondents who are children? And let me show you like some of the items. These are translations from Polish, might not be the best in some cases, okay, but I did my best. So what you will see here, we have been kind of toying with the idea of either using grammar or using something like tenses, okay? Why tenses? Because I mean everything is about tenses, and you have like kids in elementary school when they have private tutoring, they will show up and say, "Oh my God, those tenses!" Okay, and tenses are like everybody's counting tenses in English. How many do I know? Is it 16, 15, 17? So in this sense, it's extremely tangible. Okay, so this is the decision that we'll need to make. So these are some of the items, not all of the items, and some of them will definitely be adjusted, and some of them will definitely be discarded. So this is something that we are doing right now, okay? So for example, I use the internet to practice grammar, okay? Something relatively simple, okay? But we always have to remember that a questionnaire is a very crude tool, and it's a very useful tool, but you need to have the right sample and the right number of participants, and then perhaps you can hope that what you come up with will be some kind of approximation of real life, okay? So this is what we are trying to do here. And since I have just 2 minutes, I have 2 more slides, so I should be fine when it comes to time. Right, so what are the next steps and what are the future directions? Just a few words here. So the tool will be initially administered to like 200-300 children from different parts of Poland. And we've kind of, we are working on it, so we'll be able to find those children, probably 11, 12. So this will be the target group. So when we basically have the data from the piloting phase, we'll put together the final tool, and this will be the next step. We'll try to establish the factor structure, but at the end of the day, we might kind of decide that it's not possible and that maybe the tool might consist of just 20 items, and this will be like a standalone tool, and we'll just skip any kind of factor analysis at this point. An English version will be developed. Translations into different languages may be necessary. But obviously, one thing we have to remember about any tool that we develop is that those tools need to be validated in a specific context. What I'm trying to say here is that developing a tool like this in Poland doesn't mean that this will work like splendidly in a country like Spain or Turkey. I mean, we've been, you know, I've been doing research with Kata Cizer on, we were comparing like Polish and Hungarian students, and we know that it's similar, but there are some slight differences which might be related to culture or to the educational context or the kind of instruction they receive. And future studies should seek to establish links with other ID variables and attainment. This is a huge thing. I believe we simply need a tool to be able to, even if you don't believe in like studies conducted from the macro perspective, when we do have a tool, we can kind of try to use different statistical procedures. We can look at other variables like, you know, willingness to communicate, for example, or emotions or what have you. And we can also look at attainment, which in itself is a huge thing because, you know, how do we define attainment? I'm a big fan of doing this explicit, implicit, receptive, productive thing, but clearly it's extremely difficult, especially when you have like hundreds of participants, okay? So it's not so easy. Even though you're criticized so often when you publish in journals, when you take grades or when you take exam scores or when you take self-assessment, I mean, you can critique it, of course, on a number of fronts. Do we need to develop TL-specific versions of the tool? So sometime in the future, definitely not now and probably not me. But again, I said what I said at the very beginning, that, you know, there are different challenges involved in learning different languages. So at some point, you might have the core, like the core questionnaire, but you might also have some questions which would be language specific. Something I would like to do very much is to develop also a version for secondary school children, which in fact might not be very different from the version we are currently developing, maybe a little bit more sophisticated. And I'm so grateful to Pilar because I think we have this tendency, I mean, many of us, not all of us, to focus on university students because they're easily available, but actually the foundations of language learning are laid in school, in elementary school or secondary school. This is where the real thing happens, okay? So this is something that we have to be aware of. Obviously I have not focused on this enough in this talk, but you know, this was not the intention. We also need to try to find ways of exploring GLS use among children from the micro perspective. So I mean here the performance of specific language tasks, and I mean there are issues involved here which I mentioned before. So this is what I mentioned, I'm sorry. And also I think something very important, I feel this is really important, pedagogical interventions. You know, researchers are conducting so many studies, questionnaire studies, statistics, you know, correlations, whatever, like structural equation modeling, all those models. But to me, as someone who was a teacher, I would like to see more studies which are basically based on pedagogical interventions. And in this case, pedagogical interventions focusing on the use of grammar learning strategies. And I really feel very strongly that this is what we should do to be able to convince teachers that what we are doing and all the research we are conducting actually makes sense, okay? Because otherwise I don't think we can ever convince them. So that's why we are conducting this study at the university level right now. But I feel that, I mean, the tool is important and like the data we collect are important, but at the end of the day, it would be great if somebody decided to do some intervention studies also in elementary school focusing on grammar learning strategies. And clearly, different contexts require different approaches. And when I say contexts, I mean national contexts, different types of programs, but I also mean, of course, learners at different ages. And this is something that we have to be aware of. And I'll stop here. Thank you so much. Come on.
Thank you, Professor. Okay, we do have time for questions now.
Hello, Professor. It's an honor to be here. I want to ask something that was on my mind. We were always told that children in particular were always resistant to explicit instruction, especially when it comes to grammar instruction. And I know that the study is still in progress in developing grammar language, grammar learning strategies, but would you be able to give us, like, what should teachers avoid doing while instructing children implicitly, especially in the field of grammar?
You mean instructing explicitly or implicitly?
Explicitly,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
This is such a huge question, I think, because, well, let me just repeat two things. And I said at the very beginning that I do not see grammar teaching as only explicit, okay? So I tried to make it clear. Of course, when you look at the classification and so on, there is space for some explicit instruction, but at the end of the day, to me, the main focus at some point should be on using grammar, right, in communication. And when I say communication, I mean either through comprehension or through production, okay, because this is important. And also, what you're asking is basically an empirical question, but I can tell you that when we are doing this pilot study right now, one of the things we are also trying to find out from those like 30, 40, I think, elementary school learners is also how they actually feel about this kind of tool and basically learning grammar. And I'm really grateful for this because perhaps, just perhaps, when we are doing the study, we will try to, like the main study later, we may try to incorporate a question like this. But also my focus was more about like learning, not so much teaching, okay?
Teaching.
So I would like to clarify this, okay? But again, I feel grammar instruction is extremely important, like in foreign language context, but the question is how. And I would never say that grammar is just about giving rules and practicing those rules. There is much more to it than that, like corrective feedback, okay?
Yeah.
And there are some studies, I think, that have looked into like pedagogical interventions in this respect. And to me, when I talk about grammar learning strategies, also like the processing of corrective feedback, whatever form it takes, okay? Because I don't think that I can come up with separate questions for recast prompts or elicitations or whatever is one of the aims, right? So, you know, so yeah. So that's what I can say, right? At this point, I did teach little kids a while ago, but this was a lovely experience. I have to tell you, first graders, I think. And just a little bit of a digression because there was talk about aptitude today, and I feel this is very unscientific what I'm going to say, and I've done some research on working memory and aptitude. My feeling was teaching first graders of like 6, 7 years of age. If you ask them to repeat something, you could actually hear that aptitude is a real thing in terms of like being able actually to repeat something correctly, basically, okay? So just a very unscientific observation here, but I feel it is a real thing because very often we say, well, age, I mean, when you start at a very young age and so on and stuff like this. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for your
Thank you for your talk. I was very interested in what you said later on about developing this into maybe, or having this feed into strategy instruction for learners. And I really think it's important, the idea of teaching learners these strategies. But you made it sound like it was kind of like maybe an afterthought, or that it would be really nice if that could happen. And I'm kind of wondering what the purpose of the research is in terms of identifying learner strategies if it's not to feed back into instruction in some way.
It is. So if I made it seem unimportant, it is only because this has not really been happening, and I just feel that we first need to have a tool, or we need to understand more about how like children use grammar learning strategies to be able to decide on the kind of instruction we want to provide. But yes, I couldn't agree more that, you know, like at the end of the day, this is why we are doing this, right? Because why else are we conducting all of those studies? So yeah, definitely, I mean, yeah.
Okay.
But I still feel we need to have tools, okay? And we need to find out more. And this should be like a first step, to my mind at least, okay?
But another question that comes to mind is that when you give young learners questionnaire data about how they use grammar or tenses or what they do to practice, like how do we know what they're doing is effective? So you know, they might say, yes, I do this, I practice that, but we don't, how do we know that what they're doing is useful?
Yeah.
And how could that feed back into
Yeah,
instruction
let me-
unless we know the effects of what their strategies?
Yeah, let me answer this. I think the aim of the questionnaire is not really to find out what is effective, but what they do, okay?
Yeah.
And then, depending on what they do, if we are talking about interventions, to me, if we are talking about interventions, that's what we are doing right now with English majors, the intervention primarily should focus on showing students how to do things to be able to use those structures in communication. So this is like the focus on the intervention, because like English majors in Poland, you know, we teach them very advanced things and so on. But they need to have like, they need to understand basically and find out how to do it. So I'm just, what I'm trying to say here is that we need to identify what they do to be able to come up with the best instruction possible, and then, and only then look at effectiveness. Okay, so the questionnaire as such will not tell us about effectiveness, it will just tell us about what they do. Mm-hmm. So that's basically my thinking about this. Let me also tell you, you know, because the intervention we are right now introducing with English majors, oh my God, there is so, initially some of the people helping us out were so enthusiastic. But people just don't understand. I mean, people, lecturers, sometimes they feel, yeah, but I need to do a list of structures and whatever, and they don't really, it's so difficult for them to accept that sometimes, just sometimes, it's better to give students tools so that they can do things on their own than do another 10 exercises, right? And it's tough, it's just tough, it's difficult, okay? Just like, you know, a question you might ask, is it better to teach another 20 words in the classroom, or is it better to devote this time sometimes to developing skills in using dictionaries, okay? Or using like internet-based resources. Yeah, so that's basically what we are doing, and you know, and I'm not really sure. I would never say that I will be doing interventions with children. I'm too old for that, I think. But someone in the future hopefully will. And I'm just what I'm trying to do here is just to, you know, pave the way for this kind of research, okay, and for people to pick up on kind of, yeah. So thank you so much. I mean, I think we agree on. I believe so much that research should happen as much as possible in the classroom in general, okay? So it's messy, of course, right? But it's the real thing, so, yeah.
Can I go ahead? Thank you very much, Merrick. I'm here. So, learning strategies research in general, I always find it difficult, hard time to distinguish cognitive and metacognitive aspects of them, both theoretically and methodologically. And to me, like looking at the questionnaire, for example, it looks to me that the data you're getting is metacognitive, because once you ask them, like I use this strategy this much from 1 to 5, it's their metacognition of their strategy uses. And I thought your classifications of strategies was very interesting, and I thought both like affective and social aspects were both metacognitive, but metacognitive aspect is separated from affective and social, because to me, like social strategy, for example, okay, if I talked about grammar structures with my friends more, I will learn English more. That sounds metacognitive to me. So if you could tease apart cognitive and metacognitive in relation to learning strategies.
Yeah, well, let me just repeat that, you know, all of this is based, because I agree, I think I said it during the talk at some point, that there is a lot of discussion right now to what extent we actually can distinguish between those categories. And like Andrew, Cohen, and maybe Rebecca, Oxford, they will say that, you know, functions fluctuate, and I fully agree. But I also believe that for the sake of research of this kind, we just make a simplification here. And I feel that, you know, obviously there is some overlap, and this overlap can be kind of teased out maybe in studies conducted from the micro perspective. But I still believe, looking at, you know, all the history of language learning strategy research and the different classifications, that it is possible to make this simplification, even though I mean, I accept your point that there is overlap, definitely, okay, here. But also the second thing I wanted to say, and you may have noticed, that in the case of kids, we, like the tool we are, and I'm not saying, let me just say that I'm not saying that the classification is perfect or the tool is perfect. I'm actually becoming more and more aware of the many limitations. And maybe it doesn't really make sense to have this division into different categories. And maybe this is something that we might wish to abandon in the future. And actually in the tool that we are developing for children, we kind of abandoned this division into categories, right? From right now, we'll see what factor analysis will show us, kind of. But this division and the tool that I developed, I mean, this has been validated, like I think in the Iranian context, in the Chinese context. So we have basically evidence, I mean, statistical evidence, okay? So this is not the real thing, kind of, that those strategies load onto different factors, even though some of them have to be kind of discarded in the process, okay? So yes, I agree, but I still believe that for the sake of research, you can make this kind of simplification, I should say, okay? But I take your point, of course, and this is something that we need to consider. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. I'm afraid we have not enough time for more questions, but
we can stick around. No problem.
but of course, I just wanted to remind you to thank Professor again and to remind you that there is a walk-in tour and a meeting at 7. Okay, and the meeting point is Plaza de la Virgen Blanca, so the old market square, under the green sign Vitoria Gasteiz. So you might probably ask more questions to Professor Mirosław Pawlak if he agrees, okay, and continue the discussion outside.
Sure
okay,
thing.
so
Even though
thank you.
I don't think they will feel like asking questions during the walking tour. But
Or
thank you so much.
questions of some other kind. Thank you.